To just give you a nice intro to what is starting to become a pretty significant force, particularly on the climate left. The difference between ecological economics and neoclassical economics. You can transfer neoclassical to environmental economics. So the big difference that you see here is on neoclassical economics or environmental economics, we see the economy is the biggest circle outside, right? That contains everything. Within that is humanity, and within humanity is the environment. So what does this tell us? This tells us that we have complete domain and control over the environment, right? The environment is there to serve us, right? Ecological economics thinkers recognize that we actually live on a rock floating around in space, and we're actually a subset of that ecology, right? The biosphere contains everything that we hold dear, everything we've ever produced in our lifetime, in the history of humanity, way before that, and will continue to persist way after we're done here. And so within the environment, or the biosphere, or ecology, is humanity, our societies, and within that is the economy, right? So it's trying to respect the fact that we actually have limits. There are boundaries that we cannot overshoot, or else there will be significant consequences, right? Our ecology is not there just to serve us because we're humans and smarts and have smartphones and machines. We actually have to be good stewards of it, right? Because we depend on it for absolutely everything that we hold dear. So that is a big difference between environmental economics and ecological economics. Now, what happens? What has been the most dominant story narrative since the end of World War II? The growth of GDP. Absolutely, everybody is indoctrinated, and I will say indoctrinated, since they are born in middle school and high school, from the movies, from books, the people on TV, that the growth of GDP is best, right? Whenever we have a decreasing GDP or not as high growth of GDP, it's chaos. It's not good, right? It sends people worried. It messes with the stock markets. Unemployment goes up. Things are shocked. And so this has been our overarching aim, to grow our economy, because it provides more jobs, because it provides innovation, because it provides ingenuity and allows us to have all of the beautiful things that we have around us, like this really fancy camera thing over there. And so without growth, we wouldn't be where we are today. But what does that entail, right? A growth of GDP entails a growth of the use of matter and energy. What is matter? Plants, nature, soil, the ocean, water, etc., as well as human capital, let's call it, right? Human labor. And energy, right? We soak up a lot of energy from the sun, plants, from fossil fuels that were sun energy before, and that has impacts, right? And we're growing absolutely everything, right? We can see here, we call it the great acceleration. We're growing in population, in the use of energy, in paper, in fertilizers, in machines, in cups, in plastic, in absolutely anything that you can think of that hasn't been a short-lived fad. It has grown exponentially, and it is continuing to grow and grow and grow. And what does this mean? That there is an exponential growth of impacts, right? We're seeing an exponential increase in carbon dioxide, in methane, in the loss of topsoil, in temperatures, in the acidification of our oceans, in eutrophication of our oceans, in the biodiversity loss, etc., right? The growth, the use of more and more matter and energy has consequences. Business as usual, right? Let's find ways that we can keep living the way that we do and keep enjoying the things that we love, whilst lessening our impact, right, by decreasing these graphs, right? And that's what we call green growth. And green growth is a solution to, let's call it, decouple all of these impacts from economic growth, right? So how can we keep increasing our GDP, keep having more employment, keep being able to repay our debts, et cetera, and increasing tax revenue so we can pay for more social welfare, et cetera, whilst decreasing emissions, whilst reversing biodiversity loss, whilst increasing our topsoils, et cetera. So I'm gonna pick a country that we all know as a leader in fighting climate change and in being a sustainable nation. What better country than Sweden? Right? So we see here this graph, and this is the graph that they all point to, right? Oh, you can't see that it's Sweden, but it is Sweden. We see GDP has increased by over 100% in the last 50 years, whilst CO2 per capita has decreased by more than 50%, right? That's what folks have called absolute decoupling. This is what the green growthers try to say is proof that we're able to continue to grow our economies whilst reducing our impacts. But there's a lot that's not mentioned in this graph. So what would it look like if we were to remove the shady accounting, if we were able to include a couple other perspectives? Well, it doesn't look so hot anymore, right? So we see the same increase in GDP, Below, the green line is what we had seen in the previous graph. The orange line is production-based. The orange line is consumption-based, right? So consumption means that you're also taking into account the CO2 emissions that are from imported goods, right? Because we're not just offshoring everything to China. We're actually, even if we're consuming it and it's not produced here, it still counts towards our emissions. And so it's not such a clear picture anymore. They haven't decreased as much, and definitely nowhere near as fast as we need to reach the 1.5 agreement. And that's just emissions. What about resource use? Resource use per capita has increased in Sweden, right? And resource use is an excellent proxy for environmental harm because we have mines and we have oil wells, etc., right? It causes harm to use more and more resources. So the picture isn't as rosy as it might seem, and many critiquers of green growth say that it just won't happen fast enough. We have to stop thinking about how do we continue with business as usual, and how can we change the paradigm, change the narrative so that we can at the same time live freer, better, healthier lives and leave some room for our planet to breathe. We introduce degrowth. Right. And so what is degrowth? Degrowth is a temporary downscaling of production and consumption planned democratically to reduce environmental pressures in a way that is equitable, key emphasis on equitable, and for the sake of improving well-being. So it's not just telling us to reduce GDP, right? That's not a goal of degrowth. It's not just like reduce absolutely everything. It is downscaling how much matter and energy we bring into our economy and eject from our economy as waste in an equitable, democratic, participative, and just way, right? Because it matters that it's just, because there are working class folks who have worked in the automobile industry, in coal factories, et cetera, for years, decades, if not. And what, you're just going to tell them, sorry, you're out of a job because we don't need your industry anymore. That's not just. That's not fair. It's not their fault, right? And we also have to take into account the global south that has, as we all know, unjustly facing over 98% of all climate deaths. Meanwhile, they're responsible for only 8% of emissions over, say, planetary boundaries. Big emphasis, because everybody critiques it on this. This is for rich countries. This is for the EU, for North America, for Canada and the US, for Australia, Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, maybe Israel. This is not for the global south, right? We do not want the global south to degrow. We want the global south to emit more, actually, because they are in conditions where they still don't have access. Many folks still don't have access to electricity, to access to hygiene, running water, etc. So these countries still need to grow their economies. However, it's the rich nations that need to degrow their economies. That is the biggest misconception of degrowth, right? This is all for downscale of production and consumption in rich nations. The other one is we're trying to impose austerity. A reduction in GDP automatically implies that no, you cannot consume as much as you want to. You have to be poorer. You have to live with less, etc. And I'd like to counter that. The degrowth is actually trying to free people's time, free people's lives from the chains of capitalism, because people are forced to work. No, I literally, the chains of capitalism, because everybody here is forced to work to survive. If you don't work and you don't have a pretty decent state, social welfare state, you're going to die. You will be on the street and you won't be able to afford rent or nutritious food or access to mobility, etc. That is not what degrowth is calling for. We're not calling for less schools or less hospitals or less roads, etc. We're calling for less weapons, less private jets, less mansions, less beef, less advertising, etc. So it's not an overall decrease of the entire economy. We want more renewable energy, right? We want more available nutritious food, more social housing, more public electric mobility, etc. So we're not going to degrow forever, right? This graph shows you pretty well that we've reached a point where if we cross the red lines, we are overpassing our planetary boundary. So we need an immediate and effective and just reduction, but until we reach our planetary boundaries. And then we'll wobble up and down depending on what our biocapacity allows us to into what we reach as a steady state economics or post-growth. So degrowth is a transition that will eventually lead to a steady state of an economy or society that isn't continuously overshooting its biocapacity or its planetary boundaries. Now, some principles of degrowth are about spending more time with your family, right? Relationality, about spending more time with friends, about having more time to spending a couple hours eating lunch instead of just the 30 minutes you get from a lunch break. It's about sharing. It's about producing things more locally when possible. It's about producing things that are socially and ecologically necessary and reducing the amount of socially unnecessary production that we are making. It's about enjoying life, right? Joie de vivre. It's about dancing. It's about the arts and culture. It's about appreciating the little things and about trying to stop work being such a dominant factor of our lives that consumes and stresses. It's about circularity, right? It's about cooperating. It's about sustainability. And now, before you all think I'm a hippie and that this is all wishy-washy communism, let me show you that there are actually significant progress being made in developing policy agendas, genuine, real, top-down, but also bottom-up, which is very important, policies that might lead to what we might call a reduction, a degrowth of our economies, right? Things like work time reductions. The 4-day work week is very popular. I'm for a 3-day work week, right? Who doesn't want 4 days of a weekend instead of 4 days of work? By having, imagine you have less time to work, you have more time to spend with your grandparents, with your old. We might actually not need so much funding for a social safety net for seniors. We might actually just have the human capacity to take care of seniors rather than spending time at work producing crap that we don't need. It's things like housing cooperatives or work cooperatives, right? Increasing workplace democracy. Right now, we have no economic democracy. That is inexistent. There is no economic democracy almost anywhere in the world because we don't get to decide what we produce, right? Our bosses tell us what to make. Our bosses tell them what to make that we should make, right? We don't get a say in what gets produced. But by creating more cooperatives, we starting to give workers a little bit more of a say in what they do, in their working conditions, in how things function in their workplace. It's by creating maximum income caps. I mean, at a certain point, you just don't need that much money, regardless of how much you deserve it and how much hard you've worked, etc. You don't need $1 billion to live a nice, happy, solid, safe life. It's about guaranteeing jobs for people who want to work in ecologically or socially useful and necessary industries by the government. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? There is so many things below that put a huge emphasis on food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, on indigenous justice, on rethinking tourism, energy democracy, right? Creating energy communities. We should own the energy that we produce, right? We shouldn't just have some centralized, overarching private or government company telling us that this is what energy you have to consume and you don't get a say in that. That's not freedom, right? It's about eradicating poverty. It's about achieving all of the SDGs except number 8, which is economic growth. Right now, degrowth has actually been getting quite a lot of attention. Just last week, we had a huge conference in Brussels called the Beyond Growth. They didn't call it degrowth, but it was the Beyond Growth Conference, which was organized by 5 different European political parties from across the spectrum, conservatives and liberals, and very leftists as well, and the Greens, who had 2,000 people in person use pretty much the majority of the European Parliament for 2 days, and 2,000 others registered to watch online. So these ideas are definitely gaining attention. Just today, I was at Sciences Po, probably the most elitist university in Paris, where we were having a conference of degrowth with some pretty important speakers sharing ideas organized by students from Sciences Po. So these aren't crazy, irrational, naive ideas. There's genuine science of decades, over almost 1,000 scientific papers published, hundreds and hundreds of books about how we can actually achieve this reality and maybe finally let go of capitalism.